Aboard the luxurious SS Aurora, a Mediterranean cruise turns deadly when brash businessman Leonard Carver plunges to his death from the starboard deck. Was it an accident or murder? Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, unravels a web of secrets. A captain with a hidden grudge, a nervous crewman silenced by fear, a glamorous guest with a dangerous charm, and a rival consumed by betrayal. As clues mount, a torn cufflink, a threatening note, a suspicious lapse in the watch, Miss Marple must navigate deception and danger to reveal the killer before the ship reaches Gibraltar. Chapter 1. The voyage begins. The SS. Aurora lay berthed at Southampton, its gleaming white hull a beacon against the gray English sky, poised to embark on its Mediterranean odyssey. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in a wicker chair on the promenade deck, adjusted her shawl and surveyed the bustling scene with her customary quiet acuity. Her nephew, Raymond, ever solicitous, had insisted this cruise would invigorate her, a respite from the predictable rhythms of St. Mary Mead. "A change of scene, Aunt Jane," he had said, with that modern enthusiasm she found both endearing and slightly exhausting. Yet, as she watched passengers ascend the gangway, their faces alight with anticipation or shadowed by private cares, Miss Marple sensed this voyage would be anything but restful. Her eyes, bright and unyielding despite her years, noted the small details that others overlooked. The porter who lingered too long near a wealthy passenger's luggage, the fleeting frown on a young woman's face as she glanced at her companion, the captain's stiff nod to a subordinate. The Aurora was a microcosm of society, she mused, with its hierarchies and hidden tensions, not unlike her own village. She opened her knitting bag, the click of her needles a familiar comfort, and settled in to observe. Among the passengers boarding was Mr. Leonard Carver, a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. His loud laughter echoed across the deck, his broad frame clad in an ostentatiously tailored suit. He clapped a fellow passenger on the back with a familiarity that bordered on presumption, his voice carrying tales of stock market triumphs. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had known men like Carver in St. Mary Mead, men who mistook volume for authority. She noted, too, the man who trailed him, Mr. Hugo Vance, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes that held a smoldering resentment. The two exchanged no words, but the air between them crackled with unspoken enmity. Nearby, Miss Clara Beaumont, a vision in a silk dress the color of sea foam, ascended the gangway with a grace that drew admiring glances. Her laughter was light, but Miss Marple caught the calculated tilt of her head, the way her eyes darted to assess her audience. A young woman accustomed to attention, Miss Marple thought, and perhaps to wielding it. Clara paused to speak with a crew member, Tom Riley, whose boyish face betrayed a nervous energy. His hands fumbled with a rope, and his quick glance toward Carver suggested more than casual interest. As the ship's horn sounded and the Aurora eased away from the dock, Miss Marple's attention lingered on the crew. Captain Reginald Holt stood on the bridge, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid as he issued orders. Yet, when he turned to greet a passenger, his smile was strained, a mere courtesy that did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple wondered what burdens lay behind that polished facade. A steward, bustling past with a tray of glasses, whispered to a colleague about the captain's recent temper, a detail Miss Marple filed away. The first evening aboard was marked by a lavish dinner in the grand saloon, its chandeliers casting a warm glow over polished silver and crisp linens. Miss Marple, seated at a table with a retired colonel and his garrulous wife, listened politely to their tales of past voyages while her eyes roamed the room. Carver held court at a central table, his anecdotes punctuated by guffaws, though Clara Beaumont, seated nearby, seemed more interested in her champagne than his stories. Hugo Vance, at a corner table, ate in silence, his gaze fixed on Carver with an intensity that Miss Marple found disquieting. As dessert was served, a sudden hush fell over the saloon. A steward had whispered something to the captain, who rose abruptly and excused himself. Miss Marple's needles paused. She had not missed the fleeting look of alarm on Tom Riley's face as he followed the captain out. The other passengers resumed their chatter, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, when a hurried departure had preceded a scandal. "People are the same everywhere," she murmured to herself, her fingers resuming their steady rhythm. Later, as she strolled the deck under a canopy of stars, the sea air cool against her cheeks, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. The Aurora was a floating stage, its players already revealing their parts. Carver's brash confidence, Vance's quiet rancor, Clara's calculated charm, Tom's nervous deference, the captain's guarded authority. She leaned against the railing, the dark waves below a reminder of the depths beneath human facades. A sudden scream shattered the night's calm, shrill and unmistakable, from the starboard side. Passengers rushed to the railings, voices rising in confusion. Miss Marple, her heart steady despite the commotion, made her way toward the sound. A crew member shouted, "Man overboard!" and the deck erupted in chaos. Searchlights swept the water, but the sea was vast and unforgiving. Leonard Carver, it was soon confirmed, had vanished into its depths. As the crew organized a futile search, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting untouched. She gazed at the horizon, where the sea met the sky, and thought of the secrets that lay hidden among the Aurora's passengers. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that sudden death was rarely an accident. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she murmured, "Someone wanted Mr. Carver gone, and I shall find out who." Chapter 2. The Captain's Command. The morning after Leonard Carver's tragic plunge from the SS Aurora, the Mediterranean sun cast a deceptively cheerful glow over the ship's polished decks. Passengers gathered in hushed clusters, their murmurs a blend of shock and morbid curiosity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting needles moving with unhurried precision, observed the scene with the quiet detachment of one accustomed to unraveling human nature's darker threads. The sea sparkled, indifferent to the drama unfolding aboard, but Miss Marple's keen eyes missed nothing. The crew's strained efficiency, the passengers' guarded glances, and the subtle air of unease that lingered like a mist. At precisely 10 o'clock, Captain Reginald Holt emerged from the bridge to address the passengers in the grand saloon. The room, with its gleaming chandeliers and long tables now cleared of breakfast, felt cavernous as the crowd settled into uneasy silence. Captain Holt, a tall man in his 50s with a meticulously trimmed beard and a uniform that seemed an extension of his rigid demeanor, stood at the head of the room. His hands clasped behind his back, he exuded authority, yet Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his cap. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant but clipped, as though each word were measured to conceal something deeper. "It is with profound regret that I confirm the loss of Mr. Leonard Carver last night. Despite our exhaustive search, we could not locate him. We believe he fell from the starboard railing in a tragic accident. The Aurora remains on course for Gibraltar, and I assure you that the crew is doing everything to ensure your safety and comfort. I ask for your cooperation as we assist the authorities in their inquiries." The passengers exchanged glances, some nodding solemnly, others whispering doubts. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her knitting resting lightly in her lap, studied the captain's face. His eyes, a pale blue that might have been striking in youth, avoided hers, darting instead to the far wall. She recalled a similar expression on the face of Mr. Thompson, the St. Mary Mead grocer, when questioned about missing funds, a mixture of defiance and unease. Captain Holt, she mused, knew more than he was letting on. As the passengers dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her frail figure unassuming amidst the departing crowd. She approached a young steward, a lanky lad named Peter, who was clearing away coffee cups. "Such a dreadful business," she said, her voice soft and sympathetic. "You must all be terribly shaken." Peter glanced up, his freckled face betraying a flicker of relief at her kindly tone. "It's awful, ma'am. Never had anything like this on the Aurora. The captain's been on edge all morning, snapping at us more than usual." He lowered his voice. "I heard him arguing with Mr. Carver yesterday, in the corridor near the bridge. Something about investments, I think. Mr. Carver was shouting, saying the captain was a fool to trust him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh dear, how distressing. And where was the captain last night, do you know?" Peter hesitated, then shrugged. "On the bridge, I suppose. He's always there when we're underway. But I wasn't on duty then." He hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder this fragment of information. An argument over investments suggested a financial motive, and in her experience, money was a powerful spur to desperate acts. She made her way to the promenade deck, where the sea breeze carried a hint of salt and secrets. Settling into her chair, she resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The captain's address had been carefully worded, designed to quell panic, but it raised questions. Why call it an accident so soon? And why had he avoided mentioning the argument with Carver? Miss Marple's mind turned to the village of St. Mary Mead, where a similar rush to label a death accidental had masked a deeper truth. She resolved to learn more about Captain Holt. Her opportunity came at luncheon, when she found herself seated near Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard, a talkative widow with a penchant for gossip. Mrs. Pritchard, her round face framed by an extravagant hat, was eager to share her observations. "The captain's a fine figure of a man, isn't he?" she said, buttering a roll. "But I heard from Mrs. Langley, she's in the cabin next to mine, that he's not been himself lately. Something about bad investments, and he's been short with the crew ever since we boarded." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. "How unfortunate. I suppose a man in his position has many responsibilities. Did you know Mr. Carver at all?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes gleamed. "Oh, yes, such a loud man, always boasting about his wealth. I saw him arguing with that Mr. Vance, the one with the sour face, 2 days ago in the lounge. And then there was Miss Beaumont. She was all smiles with Mr. Carver, but I swear I saw her roll her eyes when he wasn't looking. I wouldn't be surprised if someone pushed him, Miss Marple. He wasn't the sort to make friends." Miss Marple murmured agreement, her mind cataloging these details. The web of relationships aboard the Aurora was growing clearer. Carver, the brash businessman, had clashed with the captain, his rival Hugo Vance, and perhaps even the charming Clara Beaumont. But it was the captain who intrigued her now. His authority gave him access to every corner of the ship, and his argument with Carver suggested a personal stake in the man's fate. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a leisurely stroll along the starboard deck where Carver had fallen. The railing was high, she noted, requiring considerable force to push a man of Carver's size over it. The deck was spotless, the crew having scrubbed it thoroughly, but she paused near the spot where the scream had originated. Her sharp eyes scanned the planks, searching for anything out of place. Near the base of a lifeboat davit, she spotted a small scuff mark, barely noticeable, as though a shoe had scraped against the wood in a struggle. She bent down, her arthritic fingers tracing the mark, and considered its implications. An accident would not leave such a mark, she thought, unless Carver had fought to save himself. As she straightened, she caught sight of Tom Riley, the nervous crew member, polishing a brass fitting nearby. His hands moved quickly, too quickly, and his eyes darted toward her before returning to his task. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Good afternoon, young man. You must be terribly busy after last night's tragedy." Tom's face flushed and he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It's been a lot. We're all shaken up." His voice was tight and he avoided her gaze. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle. "I imagine so. You were on duty last night, weren't you? It must be difficult, working under such strain." Tom's polishing slowed. "I wasn't near the starboard deck, ma'am. I was below, in the engine room, till late. Didn't see anything." His words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze. "Of course," she said kindly. "But you must hear things, working so closely with the crew. Mr. Carver seemed a man who made an impression." Tom's hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. "He was loud," he said finally. "Always talking about his money, how he'd made it big. Some of the crew didn't like him, said he treated us like servants." He clamped his mouth shut as though realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "People can be thoughtless," she said, and excused herself, leaving Tom to his work. His nervousness was telling, she thought. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young man much like Tom, a gardener who had stammered and fidgeted when questioned about a stolen brooch. He hadn't been the thief, but he'd known more than he admitted. Tom, she suspected, was hiding something. Perhaps not guilt, but knowledge. Back in her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, her knitting idle as she pieced together her observations. The captain's argument with Carver, confirmed by Peter the steward, pointed to a financial dispute. Mrs. Pritchard's gossip suggested Holt's investments had soured, and Carver's involvement seemed likely. Yet the captain's alibi, his presence on the bridge, would need verification. The scuff mark on the deck hinted at a struggle, ruling out a simple fall. And Tom's unease suggested he had seen or heard something he dared not reveal. She recalled a conversation with her friend Dolly Bantry, who had once remarked that a man's pride could be as dangerous as his greed. Captain Holt, with his impeccable uniform and rigid bearing, struck her as a man who valued control above all else. Had Carver's taunts about investments pushed him to a desperate act? Or was the captain merely a convenient suspect, his authority making him an easy target for suspicion? Miss Marple decided to seek out more about the ship's routines. She befriended Miss Agnes Fletcher, a spinster with a passion for nautical trivia, who was delighted to share her knowledge. Over tea in the lounge, Agnes explained the watch system. "The deck is never unmanned," she said, her pince-nez glinting. "There's always a lookout, even at night, but I did hear from a steward that the starboard watch was called away briefly last night. Something about a passenger needing assistance. I thought it odd." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Odd indeed," she said. "Do you know who was on duty?" Agnes shook her head. "I'm afraid not, but the captain would know. He oversees the schedules." This was a vital clue, Miss Marple thought. A lapse in the watch, however brief, could have provided the opportunity for murder. She thanked Agnes and made a mental note to examine the ship's log, if she could persuade a crew member to grant her access. The captain's role in the schedules made him central to the puzzle, but she needed more than hearsay to confirm her suspicions. As evening approached, Miss Marple attended the ship's concert, a subdued affair given the previous night's tragedy. She watched Captain Holt from across the room, noting how he mingled with passengers, his smile a mask of professionalism. Yet when he spoke to Hugo Vance, the rival businessman, his posture stiffened, and Vance's scowl deepened. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The enmity between Carver and Vance was well known, but did it extend to the captain? She also observed Clara Beaumont, who performed a song to polite applause. Clara's charm was undeniable, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance she cast toward the captain, a glance that held not flirtation, but calculation. Was Clara involved in more than her flirtations with Carver? Miss Marple filed this away, her mind already weaving a pattern from the threads of motive, opportunity, and character. As the concert ended, she lingered near the captain, who was speaking with a junior officer. "A fine performance, Captain," she said, her voice mild. "You must be proud of the Aurora's hospitality, even in such trying times." Holt's smile was tight. "We do our best, Miss Marple. A ship must maintain order, no matter the circumstances." "Quite so," she replied. "And with such a large crew, you must rely on their diligence. The deck watch, for instance, always vigilant, I presume?" His eyes flickered, but he nodded. "Always. My men know their duties." Miss Marple smiled and excused herself, her heart quickening. The captain's response was too quick, too assured. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth often lay in what was left unsaid. The scuff mark, Tom's fear, the lapse in the watch, and the captain's guarded demeanor formed a picture, incomplete but suggestive. Someone had ensured Carver was alone on that deck, and the captain, with his authority and his grudge, was a figure worth watching. As she retired to her cabin, the sea whispering beyond her porthole, Miss Marple reflected on the Aurora's polished surface and the secrets it concealed. "People are never what they seem," she murmured, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "And I shall find out what lies beneath." Chapter 3. The Crew Member's Secret. The SS. Aurora sliced through the Mediterranean's glassy waters, its steady hum a deceptive lullaby against the undercurrent of suspicion that had settled over the ship. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her familiar wicker chair on the promenade deck, watched the horizon with eyes that belied her frail appearance. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles idle for once, as her mind turned over the fragments of the puzzle surrounding Leonard Carver's death. The captain's guarded demeanor and financial ties to Carver were intriguing, but another figure had caught her attention. Tom Riley, the young crew member whose nervous fidgeting suggested a burden too heavy for his slight shoulders. The morning was bright, with gulls wheeling overhead, their cries sharp against the murmur of passengers strolling the deck. Miss Marple noted the forced cheer in their conversations, as though they sought to banish the shadow of the previous night's tragedy. She had learned in her quiet years at St. Mary Mead that fear often hid behind laughter and secrets behind mundane tasks. Tom Riley, tasked with cleaning the starboard deck where Carver had fallen, was a case in point. His movements were jerky, his eyes darting as he scrubbed the already spotless planks. Miss Marple decided he warranted closer scrutiny. She rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and approached him with the unhurried gait of an elderly lady out for a constitutional. "Good morning, Mr. Riley," she said, her voice warm with the gentle curiosity that disarmed even the wariest souls. "You've been working so diligently. It must be difficult, keeping the ship so pristine after such a dreadful event." Tom started, nearly dropping his rag, and his freckled face flushed. "Oh, mornin', ma'am," he stammered, his accent betraying a working-class London upbringing. "Just doing my job is all. Gotta keep things ship-shape." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. "It's a fine ship, and you're clearly devoted to it. I imagine you see all sorts of things, working as you do. Passengers can be so careless, can't they?" Tom's eyes flicked toward the railing, then back to his task. "Some are, ma'am. Not all, but some." He scrubbed harder, though the deck gleamed. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent interest. "Mr. Carver, for instance, such a boisterous man. I suppose he kept the crew busy." Tom's rag slowed, and he swallowed hard. "He was particular, ma'am. Liked things his way. Always shouting orders, like he owned the ship." His voice held a trace of resentment, quickly masked. "But I didn't know him, not really." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "Of course, you're far too busy to notice every passenger, though I imagine you'd notice if something unusual happened, say, near the starboard railing that night." She paused, watching his reaction. Tom's hands froze, and a bead of sweat traced down his temple, despite the cool breeze. "I wasn't there, ma'am," he said too quickly. "I was below decks, checking supplies. Didn't see nothing." He resumed scrubbing with a vigor that bordered on desperation. Miss Marple murmured a sympathetic sound and moved on, leaving him to his work. His denial was emphatic, but his fear was palpable. She recalled young Jimmy Brown from St. Mary Mead, who had trembled just so when questioned about a broken window. Jimmy hadn't thrown the stone, but he'd known who had. Tom Riley, she suspected, was similarly caught between truth and silence. She settled back in her chair, her knitting resumed, and considered her next move. Tom's role on the ship gave him access to its every corner, but his youth and low rank made him an unlikely mastermind. More likely, he was a witness or a pawn. To learn more, she needed to understand his world. She sought out Elsie, a cheerful stewardess who had served her tea the previous day. Elsie, with her rosy cheeks and penchant for chatter, was easily drawn into conversation over a cup of Earl Grey in the lounge. "It's such a shame about Mr. Carver," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "The crew must be under such strain. That young man, Tom Riley, seems quite shaken." Elsie's eyes widened, eager to share. "Oh, Tom's a good lad, ma'am, but he's been jumpy as a cat since yesterday. Mind you, he's got reason. He's in debt, you see. Gambling, I heard. Owes money to some rough types in London. He was hoping this job would clear it, but Mr. Carver was giving him grief." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Grief? How so?" Elsie leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Tom told me Mr. Carver caught him taking a break once, called him lazy, threatened to report him, said he'd make sure Tom never worked on a ship again. Tom was terrified. He needs this job. And," she hesitated, glancing around, "I saw him pass a note to someone in the lounge last night, just before the scream. Looked secretive-like." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, betraying none of her excitement. "A note? How curious. Did you see who it was for?" Elsie shook her head. "Couldn't tell, ma'am. It was dark and I was rushing to clear tables, but Tom's been acting strange ever since." Thanking Elsie, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. A debt-ridden crew member, bullied by Carver, passing a note just before the tragedy. This was no coincidence. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young maid had been coerced into silence by a threatening employer. Tom's fear suggested he was entangled in something larger, perhaps blackmailed or coerced. But by whom? That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a deck game of shuffleboard, more to observe than to play. Tom was nearby, assisting with equipment, his eyes downcast. She noted how he avoided the starboard railing, as though it held some dread. Across the deck, Clara Beaumont laughed brightly, her silk scarf fluttering as she tossed a puck. Hugo Vance watched from a distance, his lean frame tense, while Captain Holt, making his rounds, paused to exchange pleasantries with passengers. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on each, wondering who might have drawn Tom into their orbit. Her chance to probe further came unexpectedly. As she passed the crew's quarters on her way to the library, she overheard raised voices from a storage room. Pausing, her small figure nearly invisible in the corridor's shadow, she recognized Tom's voice, laced with panic. "I told you, I didn't say nothing. I kept my mouth shut, like you said." Another voice, low and indistinct, replied, "You'd better, or you'll regret it." The door creaked, and Miss Marple slipped behind a stack of crates, her heart steady despite the risk. Tom emerged, his face pale, and hurried down the corridor. The second figure remained hidden, but the threat hung in the air like damp fog. Miss Marple returned to the library, her mind alight with possibilities. The note, the threat, Tom's fear, all pointed to a conspiracy. She requested a ship's manifest from the purser, a genial man named Mr. Dawkins, under the pretense of curiosity about the Aurora's operations. Scanning the crew list, she confirmed Tom's role as a deckhand, with duties that included night shifts. His schedule would have placed him near the starboard deck, despite his claim of being below. A lie, then, but why? She recalled the scuff mark she had found the previous day, near the lifeboat David. It suggested a struggle, and Tom's strength, honed by manual labor, could have played a part. Yet his fear suggested he was not the instigator. Someone with power over the ship or over Tom's debts had silenced him. The captain, with his authority? Hugo Vance, with his grudge against Carver? Or Clara, whose charm might conceal a sharper edge? That evening at dinner, Miss Marple observed Tom serving in the saloon, his hands trembling as he poured wine. She caught his eye, offering a kind smile, but he looked away, his jaw tight. Across the room, Captain Holt conversed with a group of passengers, his manner polished but distant. Clara Beaumont, radiant in a sapphire gown, laughed at a jest, while Hugo Vance sat alone, his fork picking at his plate. The pieces were there, Miss Marple thought, but the pattern remained elusive. As the meal ended, she lingered, pretending to search for a dropped handkerchief. Near the lounge, she saw Tom slip a folded paper into a passenger's hand, a swift, furtive motion. The recipient, obscured by the crowd, vanished before she could identify them. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The note, she was certain, held a key to the mystery. In St. Mary Mead, a similar exchange of notes had unraveled a case of blackmail. Here, aboard the Aurora, the stakes were higher. Returning to her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the sea's dark expanse mirroring her thoughts. Tom Riley was no murderer, she concluded, but he knew something, perhaps enough to endanger him. The threat she had overheard suggested a controlling hand, someone who exploited Tom's vulnerability. Her mind turned to the captain's financial troubles, Vance's bitterness, and Clara's calculated charm. One of them, she was certain, held the reins of this plot. As she prepared for bed, her knitting folded neatly beside her. Miss Marple murmured, "Secrets are like knots, my dear. Tug gently, and they unravel." She resolved to watch Tom closely, for his fear was a thread that might lead her to the truth. Chapter 4. The Guest's Charm. The SS. Aurora glided through the Mediterranean's tranquil waters, the late afternoon sun casting golden ripples that belied the tension simmering among its passengers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting a soft rhythm in her hands, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of quiet curiosity and piercing insight. The ship's elegance, its polished brass, crisp linens, and attentive crew, masked a growing unease, as if the very air carried whispers of Leonard Carver's untimely end. Her thoughts, sharpened by years of unraveling village intrigues in St. Mary Mead, now turned to Clara Beaumont, the glamorous young guest whose charm seemed as calculated as it was captivating. Clara moved through the deck like a bright flame, her laughter drawing eyes and her sea-foam silk dress catching the light. Passengers smiled at her approach, men tipping their hats and women murmuring admiration. Yet Miss Marple, whose frail appearance cloaked a mind as keen as a blade, noted the subtle artifice in Clara's gestures, the tilt of her head when she spoke, the way her eyes scanned the crowd before settling on a target. There was something deliberate, Miss Marple thought, in how Clara wielded her allure, not unlike Mrs. Elwood from St. Mary Mead, whose flirtations had once concealed a scheme to fleece a wealthy widower. Miss Marple had observed Clara closely at dinner the first night, when the young woman had sat near Leonard Carver, her laughter bright but her eyes cool. Carver, with his booming voice and expansive gestures, had basked in her attention, yet Miss Marple had caught a fleeting glance Clara cast toward Hugo Vance, the rival businessman seated across the saloon. It was a look not of affection, but of appraisal, as if weighing his presence against some private calculus. Now, with Carver gone, Clara's behavior warranted scrutiny. Was she merely a bystander, or had her charm played a role in the events that led to his plunge into the sea? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple joined a group of ladies for afternoon tea in the ship's elegant lounge, where Clara held court at a nearby table. The room buzzed with subdued chatter, the clink of porcelain mingling with murmurs about the accident. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened as Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard, the talkative widow from the previous day, leaned close. "That Miss Beaumont," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice low but eager. "She's quite the siren, isn't she? I saw her with Mr. Carver before he— well, you know. She was all smiles, but I swear there was something sharp in her eyes. And yesterday I caught her whispering with Mr. Vance in the corridor. Looked awfully cozy." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of mild surprise. "Whispering, you say? How intriguing. I suppose young ladies like Miss Beaumont attract all sorts of attention." Mrs. Pritchard nodded vigorously. "Oh, yes, but there's more. My maid, Jenny, said she saw Miss Beaumont coming out of Mr. Carver's cabin the evening before he fell. In a hurry, Jenny said, like she didn't want to be seen." This was a significant thread, Miss Marple thought, her mind racing. A visit to Carver's cabin suggested intimacy, or intrigue. She thanked Mrs. Pritchard and turned her attention to Clara, who was now laughing with a group of young officers. Her voice carried a musical lilt, but Miss Marple noted how her gaze flicked toward the door, as if expecting someone. Was it Vance? Or perhaps the captain, whose absence from the lounge was conspicuous. To test her suspicions, Miss Marple devised a small experiment. She approached Clara during a lull in the conversation, her demeanor that of a kindly old lady seeking company. "My dear," she said, "you must tell me how you managed to look so radiant on this voyage. A young woman like you must find the ship's entertainments quite diverting." Clara's smile was immediate, her eyes sparkling with practiced warmth. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're too kind. It's just the sea air, I think. And the company, of course. Everyone's been so charming." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her fingers around her teacup. "I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I noticed you were quite friendly with poor Mr. Carver. Such a shock, his accident. Did you know him well?" Clara's smile faltered, just for a moment before she recovered. "Not terribly well," she said, her voice light but careful. "He was entertaining in his way, always full of stories about his business ventures. But I'm afraid I didn't know him beyond a few conversations." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but unyielding. "Of course. It's just that he seemed so taken with you. I thought perhaps you'd shared some confidences." Clara's laugh was a touch too bright. "Oh, no, nothing like that. Just polite chatter." She excused herself, citing a need to freshen up, and glided away, her scarf trailing like a comet's tail. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind alight with possibilities. Clara's deflection was skillful, but her unease was evident. The visit to Carver's cabin, if true, suggested a connection beyond polite chatter. Had she lured him to the starboard deck? Or was she protecting someone else? Miss Marple recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead, Lily Carter, whose flirtations had masked her role as an accomplice in a theft. Clara, she suspected, was no innocent bystander. Her next opportunity came unexpectedly in the ship's library, a quiet haven of polished wood and leather-bound volumes. Miss Marple, browsing the shelves, noticed a crumpled piece of paper tucked behind a copy of Pride and Prejudice. Unfolding it, she found a note in a feminine hand. "You'll regret crossing me. Meet me at 10, starboard deck." The ink was fresh, the paper scented faintly of jasmine. Clara's perfume, Miss Marple recalled from the tea. Was this meant for Carver? The timing matched the night of his death, and the threat was unmistakable. Pocketing the note, Miss Marple considered its implications. A rendezvous on the starboard deck suggested premeditation, but the note's tone hinted at a personal grievance. Had Carver wronged Clara, or was she acting on behalf of another? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Hugo Vance, whose enmity with Carver was no secret, and to Captain Holt, whose financial ties to the dead man lingered in her mind. Clara's interactions with both men warranted further observation. That evening, at the captain's cocktail reception, Miss Marple watched Clara navigate the crowd with effortless grace. She wore a sapphire gown that drew admiring glances, her laughter a melody that masked any tension. Yet Miss Marple noted how Clara's eyes lingered on Hugo Vance, who stood alone by the bar, his expression dour. When Clara approached him, their conversation was brief but intense, her hand brushing his arm before she moved on. Miss Marple, sipping a sherry, wondered if their connection was romantic or conspiratorial. She also observed Tom Riley, the nervous crew member, serving drinks with a forced smile. His eyes followed Clara, and Miss Marple recalled Elsie's tale of the note he'd passed in the lounge. Was Clara the recipient? The possibility intrigued her. If Tom was entangled in a scheme, Clara's charm could easily have drawn him in, much as it had Carver. To test this theory, Miss Marple engaged Clara in conversation near the dessert table, her tone light but probing. "You must find the crew so helpful, my dear," she said. "That young man, Tom Riley, seems quite attentive. I suppose he's been a great help to you." Clara's smile was flawless, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Tom? Oh, he's sweet enough, always rushing about, but I hardly know him." She paused, then added, "He's just a boy, really, not the sort to get involved in anything serious." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course, young men can be so impressionable, can't they? Especially around someone as charming as you." Clara laughed, but it was strained. "You flatter me, Miss Marple. I'm just here to enjoy the cruise." She excused herself, her departure a touch too hasty. As the evening wound down, Miss Marple lingered near the lounge, where she saw Clara slip into a shadowed corridor. Curious, she followed at a discreet distance, her soft-soled shoes silent on the carpet. Clara paused near a stairwell, glancing around before speaking to someone out of sight. Miss Marple couldn't hear the words, but Clara's posture, tense, urgent, suggested a clandestine meeting. Before Miss Marple could approach, Clara vanished down the stairs, and the other figure was gone. Returning to her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the note from the library in her hand. The sea beyond was a dark mirror, reflecting her thoughts. Clara Beaumont was no mere socialite. Her charm was a tool, perhaps a weapon. The note, the cabin visit, her whispered exchanges with Vance and possibly Tom, all pointed to a role in Carver's death, whether as instigator or accomplice. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen how beauty could mask ambition, and Clara's poise reminded her of a chess queen moving with purpose across the board. As she folded the note and tucked it into her knitting bag, Miss Marple murmured, "A charming young woman can be dangerous indeed. But whose game is she playing?" She resolved to watch Clara closely, for the truth, she sensed, lay just beneath the surface of her radiant smile. Chapter 5. The Rival's Grudge. The SS Aurora sailed smoothly toward Gibraltar, its decks bathed in the soft glow of a Mediterranean twilight. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting a quiet companion, watched the passengers with eyes that missed little. The air was warm, scented with salt, and the faint perfume of evening flowers from the ship's conservatory. But an undercurrent of tension lingered, as palpable as the hum of the engines below. Leonard Carver's death, officially deemed an accident, had left a shadow over the voyage, and Miss Marple's sharp mind was piecing together the threads of motive and opportunity. Her attention now turned to Hugo Vance, the lean, sharp-featured businessman whose enmity with Carver had been as evident as the stars now emerging above. Hugo Vance was a study in contrasts to the boisterous Carver. Where Carver had filled rooms with his laughter and boasts, Vance moved with a quiet intensity, his dark eyes holding a smoldering resentment that Miss Marple found both intriguing and unsettling. She had observed him at dinner the first night, seated at a corner table, his gaze fixed on Carver with a hostility that spoke of deep-rooted grievance. The gossip of Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard had confirmed what Miss Marple suspected. Vance's business had nearly collapsed after Carver outmaneuvered him in a deal, costing him a fortune and, perhaps, more personal losses. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known men like Vance, reserved, proud, and dangerous when pushed too far. This evening, as passengers gathered in the ship's bar for cocktails, Miss Marple chose a seat near the window, her knitting a pretext for lingering observation. Vance stood alone at the bar, his long fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey, his posture rigid. The bar was lively, with Clara Beaumont's laughter rising above the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation, but Vance seemed apart, his thoughts elsewhere. Miss Marple noted how his eyes flicked toward the door whenever someone entered, as if anticipating or dreading an arrival. She recalled the torn cufflink she had found near the starboard railing, engraved with the initials HV. It was a small but significant clue, suggesting Vance's presence at the scene of Carver's fall. Yet she knew from experience that clues could be misleading, planted to misdirect. To understand Vance's role, she needed to probe his motives, and for that, she required a closer encounter. Her opportunity came when Vance stepped onto the deck for a cigarette, the glow of its tip a small beacon in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn against the evening chill, approached with her usual air of harmless curiosity. "Good evening, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft and disarming. "I hope I'm not intruding. The sea is so lovely at this hour, don't you think?" Vance turned, his expression guarded but polite. "Evening, Miss Marple, is it?" His voice was low, with a clipped precision that suggested control. "Yes, the sea's fine. Quiet, at least." Miss Marple smiled, settling beside him at the railing. "Quite a contrast to the bustle aboard. I imagine you're used to quieter settings, being in business. I hear you and Mr. Carver were competitors." Vance's jaw tightened, and he took a long drag on his cigarette. "Competitors," he said, the word bitter. "That's one way to put it. Carver was a shark, Miss Marple. He'd ruin a man without a second thought. Took half my company in a deal I should have seen coming." He exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes distant. "Not that it matters now." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing counterpoint to his tension. "How dreadful," she said. "Business can be so ruthless. I suppose you must have been relieved to see him." "Well, no longer a concern. Vance's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and wary. Relieved? I won't pretend I liked him, but I didn't push him over that railing, if that's what you're getting at. He flicked his cigarette into the sea, his movements abrupt. Carver had enemies everywhere. I wasn't the only one. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing, though I imagine such a rivalry could weigh heavily. In my village, I've seen how old grudges can fester. Vance's laugh was short and humorless. Fester's the word. Carver didn't just take my business. He spread lies, cost me personal things. But I'm no murderer, Miss Marple. I'd rather see a man like him squirm than sink. He turned away, his shoulders stiff, and excused himself. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloging his words. The personal loss he hinted at intrigued her. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a farmer, Mr. Grayson, whose quiet demeanor hid a vendetta over a stolen fiancé. Vance's bitterness suggested a similar wound, deeper than mere financial loss. The cufflink, too, gnawed at her thoughts. Was it his, lost in a struggle, or a deliberate plant to implicate him? Her next clue came unexpectedly at breakfast the following morning. Seated near a group of chatty passengers, Miss Marple overheard a retired solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves, recounting a conversation he'd had with Vance in the smoking room. He was 3 sheets to the wind, Hargreaves said, chuckling. Kept muttering about Carver getting what he deserved. Said something about a woman years ago and how Carver ruined everything. I didn't press him. Man looked ready to punch a wall. Miss Marple's teacup paused midway to her lips. A woman, then. The personal loss Vance had hinted at took shape. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a jilted suitor had harbored a grudge that led to sabotage. Had Carver's lies, as Vance claimed, cost him a love as well as a livelihood? Such a motive could drive a man to violence, especially one as proud as Vance appeared to be. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple sought out the ship's purser, Mr. Dawkins, under the guise of inquiring about a lost brooch. Dawkins, a genial man with a penchant for efficiency, was happy to chat. "Mr. Vance keeps to himself," he said, checking his ledger. "But he's been on edge since we sailed. Asked for a cabin change the first day. Wanted to be as far from Carver's suite as possible. I thought it odd, but we accommodated him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild concern. "How thoughtful of you. I suppose Mr. Vance must have had his reasons. Did he and Mr. Carver cross paths often?" Dawkins hesitated, then leaned closer. "More than you'd think. I saw them arguing in the corridor 2 days before. Well, you know. Vance was red in the face, saying something about paying for what you did. Carver just laughed it off. I had to step in before it came to blows." This confirmed the depth of Vance's animosity, Miss Marple thought. She thanked Dawkins and made her way to the library, where she often found clarity among the quiet shelves. There, she reflected on the cufflink, the overheard remarks, and Vance's own admissions. His grudge was undeniable, but his candor puzzled her. A guilty man, she reasoned, would hide his hatred, not flaunt it. Yet the cufflink placed him, or someone posing as him, at the scene. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside. Peering through the library window, she saw Vance in heated discussion with Clara Beaumont near the lifeboats. Clara's hand rested briefly on his arm, her expression earnest, while Vance shook his head, his face a mask of frustration. Miss Marple couldn't hear their words, but their body language suggested a shared secret, or a disagreement. Was Clara, with her calculated charm, entangled with Vance? Had she played a role in drawing Carver to the deck, as the note in the library suggested? To test this, Miss Marple attended the evening's dance in the Grand Saloon, where Vance was present, though he stood apart, nursing a drink. Clara, radiant as ever, danced with a young officer, her laughter bright, but her eyes straying to Vance. Miss Marple, seated with a group of older ladies, watched as Tom Riley, the nervous crew member, passed by Vance's table, his movements stiff. No note was exchanged this time, but Miss Marple noted Vance's quick glance at Tom, followed by a subtle nod. Was Tom, with his debts and fear, under Vance's influence? As the music swelled, Miss Marple approached Vance, feigning a stumble to draw his attention. "Oh dear," she said, steadying herself. "These dances are rather lively for an old lady. You must find them a welcome distraction, Mr. Vance." He offered a tight smile, helping her to a chair. "Not much for dancing, Miss Marple, but it passes the time." "You're wise to stay observant," she said, her tone light. "One sees so much at these events. I noticed you and Miss Beaumont seem acquainted. She's such a charming young woman." Vance's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. Clara's. "Friendly. We've spoken a few times. Nothing more." His tone was curt, and he excused himself, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his defensiveness. In her cabin that night, the sea's gentle sway a backdrop to her thoughts, Miss Marple laid out her clues. The cufflink, Vance's grudge, his cryptic remarks about a woman, his tense exchange with Clara, and his nod to Tom. The pieces suggested a man driven by personal betrayal, but his openness raised doubts. A murderer, she mused, would be more guarded. Yet the cufflink and his proximity to Clara and Tom kept him in the frame. As she tucked her knitting away, Miss Marple murmured, "A grudge can burn slowly, but it can flare at the right moment. Mr. Vance, what did you do when that moment came?" She resolved to watch him closely, for his bitterness was a thread that might yet unravel the truth. Chapter 6. A Clue in the Night. The SS. Aurora pressed onward through the Mediterranean, its sleek form cutting through the inky waves under a canopy of stars. The night air was cool, carrying the tang of salt and the faint hum of the ship's engines, a steady pulse that belied the disquiet among its passengers. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the evening chill, paced the promenade deck with the slow, deliberate steps of an elderly lady taking the air. Yet her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the shadows, alert for any sign that might illuminate the mystery of Leonard Carver's death. Her mind, honed by years of untangling the secrets of St. Mary Mead, was alive with the threads she had gathered. Captain Holt's financial ties, Tom Riley's nervous secrecy, Clara Beaumont's calculated charm, and Hugo Vance's smoldering grudge. Tonight, she sought a new piece of the puzzle, for she knew that darkness often revealed what daylight concealed. Miss Marple had taken to wandering the ship at odd hours, her unassuming presence allowing her to blend into the background. The deck was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of a late-night stroller or the soft tread of a crew member on patrol. She paused near the starboard railing, where Carver had met his end, and studied the spot with renewed focus. The scuff mark she had noticed earlier near the lifeboat David was still faintly visible, a silent testament to a struggle. She bent down, her arthritic fingers tracing the mark, and considered its implications. It was too precise for a mere accident, suggesting force and intent. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft clink nearby, like metal against wood. Straightening, she peered into the shadows and spotted a small object glinting under the moonlight, half hidden beneath a coil of rope. She retrieved it with care. A torn cufflink, its silver surface engraved with the initials H.V. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Hugo Vance's initials. Unmistakably, yet the discovery felt too convenient. In St. Mary Mead, she had once found a monogrammed handkerchief at the scene of a theft, only to learn it had been planted to mislead. Was this cufflink evidence of Vance's presence, or a deliberate misdirection? She slipped it into her pocket, resolving to verify its owner. Her attention shifted to the ship's routines, for she suspected the key to Carver's death lay in the timing of his fall. The lapse in the deck watch, mentioned by Agnes Fletcher, was a critical detail. To confirm it, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Dawkins, the purser, whom she found in his office, poring over paperwork. With her usual blend of charm and guile, she feigned interest in the ship's operations. "Mr. Dawkins," she said, her voice soft, "I do admire how smoothly the Aurora runs. The crew's schedules must be terribly complex. I suppose you keep a detailed log of their duties?" Dawkins, flattered by her interest, nodded. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. Everything's recorded. The watch schedules, maintenance, all of it. The captain insists on precision." He hesitated, then added, "Though I heard there was a mix-up the night Mr. Carver fell. One of the lookouts was called away, left the starboard deck unmanned for a few minutes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How unusual. Might I see the log? I'm so curious about how a ship like this functions." Dawkins, charmed by her earnestness, obliged, retrieving a leather-bound ledger. As he flipped to the relevant page, Miss Marple scanned the entries. The starboard watch, assigned to a crewman named Jenkins, had indeed been interrupted at 9:55 p.m. for a passenger assistance call, returning at 10:05 p.m., precisely the window of Carver's fall. The brevity of the lapse was telling. It suggested someone familiar with the schedule, someone who could exploit those fleeting minutes. She thanked Dawkins, her mind racing with possibilities. As she left the purser's office, Miss Marple reflected on the cufflink and the watch lapse. The former pointed to Vance, but its discovery felt staged. The latter implicated someone with knowledge of the ship's routines, Captain Holt, perhaps, or even Tom Riley, whose duties included deck patrols. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's absence from his post had allowed a theft to occur, orchestrated by someone who knew his habits. Here, the lapse was no accident, she was certain. Her wanderings took her to the lounge, where a late-night card game was underway. Clara Beaumont, radiant in a silver dress, laughed with a group of passengers, but Miss Marple noted her quick glance toward the door, as if expecting someone. Hugo Vance was absent, but Tom Riley hovered nearby, clearing glasses with a nervousness that bordered on panic. Miss Marple lingered, pretending to admire a painting, and watched as Tom brushed past Clara, his hand slipping something into her palm, a swift, almost imperceptible motion. Clara's fingers closed around it, and she tucked it into her handbag without a glance. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another note, she thought, recalling Elsie's tale of Tom's secretive exchange the night of Carver's death. Was Clara directing him, or was she merely a courier? The connection between them was growing clearer, but its purpose remained elusive. She considered following Clara, but decided against it. The young woman was too alert, and Miss Marple's strength lay in observation, not pursuit. Instead, she made her way to the ship's telegraph office, where she hoped to glean more about the passengers' communications. The operator, a young man named Harold, was amenable to her gentle inquiries, mistaking her for a harmless old lady. "Any interesting messages today, Harold?" she asked, her tone light. "I imagine a ship like this is a hub of secrets." Harold chuckled. "Not much, ma'am, though Mr. Vance sent a wire to London yesterday, something about a business deal. Sounded urgent, and Miss Beaumont's been sending cables to Paris. Fashion business, she said." Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. Vance's urgency suggested he was tying up loose ends, perhaps related to Carver's death. Clara's cables, meanwhile, might be a cover for something less innocent. She thanked Harold and returned to the deck, her mind turning over the clues. The cufflink, the watch lapse, Tom's note to Clara, Vance's telegram, and the scuff mark's silent testimony. As she stood by the railing, the sea a dark expanse below, Miss Marple recalled a night in St. Mary Mead when a single clue, a dropped earring, had unraveled a burglary. Here the cufflink was her earring, but its meaning was unclear. Was Vance the culprit, his presence marked by the cufflink? Or was someone framing him, exploiting his known hatred for Carver? The watch lapse pointed to an insider, and Tom's fear suggested coercion. Clara's role, with her notes and whispered meetings, was pivotal, but whether she was puppet or puppeteer remained to be seen. In her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the cufflink in her hand. Its weight was slight, but its implications heavy. She thought of Captain Holt, whose authority could manipulate schedules, of Tom, whose debts made him vulnerable, and of Clara, whose charm wove through the mystery like a golden thread. Vance, with his grudge, was the most obvious suspect, yet his openness puzzled her. A guilty man, she mused, would hide his tracks better. As she tucked the cufflink into her knitting bag, Miss Marple murmured, "Clues are like stars, bright, but only useful if you know their place in the sky." She resolved to verify the cufflink's owner and probe the watch lapse further. For the night, she sensed, had given her a glimpse of the truth, and she would follow it to its source. Chapter 7. The Captain's Alibi. The SS Aurora sailed steadily toward Gibraltar, its white hull gleaming under a midday sun that did little to dispel the chill of suspicion lingering among its passengers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the sea's rhythmic slap, observed the ship's routines with the quiet intensity of a village spinster, accustomed to seeing beneath surfaces. The memory of Leonard Carver's plunge into the dark waters haunted the ship, and Miss Marple's mind, sharpened by years of unraveling St. Mary Mead's secrets, was piecing together the threads of motive and opportunity. Her focus now turned to Captain Reginald Holt, whose rigid authority and strained demeanor suggested a man burdened by more than the responsibilities of command. The captain had been a presence since the voyage began, his impeccable uniform and clipped speech projecting an image of control. Yet Miss Marple had noted the faint tremor in his hands during his address to the passengers, and the steward's tale of his argument with Carver over investments hinted at a personal stake in the tragedy. His claim of being on the bridge at the time of Carver's fall was plausible, but in her experience, alibis were only as strong as the truths behind them. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead Vicar, whose impeccable reputation had masked a penchant for petty theft until a single inconsistency betrayed him. Captain Holt, she decided, warranted closer scrutiny. Her opportunity came that afternoon when the captain, in a gesture of goodwill, invited a select group of passengers to tea on the bridge. Miss Marple, included thanks to her unassuming charm, arrived promptly, her shawl neatly draped and her eyes bright with curiosity. The bridge was a marvel of polished brass and gleaming instruments, the crew moving with practiced efficiency under Holt's watchful gaze. He greeted the guests with a smile that was more duty than warmth, his pale blue eyes flickering as they met hers. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the sea itself. "It's a rare privilege to see the heart of the aurora. I trust you'll find it as fascinating as I do." He gestured to the charts and controls, launching into a brief explanation of navigation that Miss Marple followed with polite interest, though her attention was on the man himself. His hands, she noted, gripped the edge of a table, and his smile faltered when a junior officer mentioned the night watch. As the group sipped tea, Miss Marple maneuvered to stand beside him. "Captain Holt," she said, her voice soft and deferential, "you must have such a weighty responsibility commanding this splendid ship. I imagine you rarely leave the bridge, especially at night." Holt's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Quite so, Miss Marple. The bridge is my post, particularly during evening hours. I was here the night poor Mr. Carver fell, overseeing our course." His tone was firm, but his fingers drummed a faint rhythm on his teacup. "How reassuring," Miss Marple said, her smile guileless. "With so many crew members, it must be a challenge to ensure everyone is where they should be. That lapse in the starboard watch, for instance, such an unfortunate coincidence." Holt's face stiffened, and for a moment she thought he might deflect. "A minor oversight," he said, his voice tight. "The crew member was called to assist a passenger. It happens, but it's rare. My men know their duties." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes soft but searching. "And you've known Mr. Carver for some time? I understand. Such a loss must be doubly hard for you." Holt's jaw tightened, and he set his cup down with a faint clink. "I knew him in a business capacity, yes, a forceful man, not always easy to deal with. But I run a tight ship, Miss Marple. Personal matters don't interfere with my duties." He excused himself to speak with an officer, leaving her to ponder his words. His defensiveness was telling, Miss Marple thought as she rejoined the group. The bridge alibi was strong, but the lapse in the watch suggested someone with authority could manipulate schedules. Holt's financial troubles, hinted at by Mrs. Pritchard and confirmed by the steward's gossip, pointed to a motive. Had Carver's investment schemes cost Holt more than money, perhaps his pride or reputation? She resolved to verify his alibi and probe his connection to Carver further. Her chance came later that day, when she encountered Mr. Jenkins, the crewman who had been on the starboard watch. Jenkins, a burly man with a weathered face, was polishing a railing near the lifeboats. Miss Marple approached, her demeanor that of a kindly old lady seeking conversation. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jenkins," she said, pausing to admire the view. "You must see such wonders from the deck at night, though I suppose it's lonely work, keeping watch." Jenkins nodded, his hands steady but his eyes wary. "Aye, ma'am, quiet most nights, except, well, you know." He glanced toward the starboard railing, his expression uneasy. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle. "Such a dreadful thing, Mr. Carver's fall. I heard you were called away that night. It must weigh on you, wondering if you could have prevented it." Jenkins shifted, his cloth slowing. "Wasn't my fault, ma'am. Got a call to help a passenger with a locked cabin door. Took 5 minutes, maybe 10. By the time I got back, it was over." He hesitated, then added, "Captain's orders, you know. We don't question 'em." Miss Marple's needles paused in her lap, though she kept her expression mild. "Of course, the captain must rely on you all so much. Was it he who called you away?" Jenkins shook his head. "No, ma'am. Came through the ship's intercom, from the purser's office. Didn't think much of it at the time." He resumed polishing, clearly eager to end the conversation. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, her mind racing. The call from the purser's office was a critical detail. Dawkins had mentioned no such request in their earlier talk, and she doubted he would overlook something so significant. Someone had engineered the lapse, and Holt, with his authority, could have arranged it indirectly. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead case, where a forged note had lured a watchman from his post, allowing a burglary. Here the stakes were higher, and the captain's role was increasingly suspect. That evening, at the ship's lecture on Mediterranean history, Miss Marple observed Holt from a distance. He stood at the back, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room. When Clara Beaumont entered, late and radiant, his gaze lingered on her, a flicker of something, concern, perhaps, crossing his face. Miss Marple noted, too, how Hugo Vance, seated nearby, watched the captain with a scowl. The web of connections, Holt, Clara, Vance, and Tom Riley, was tightening, but the center remained elusive. To test Holt's alibi further, Miss Marple sought out the ship's radio officer, Mr. Carter, a young man with a penchant for storytelling. Over a cup of tea in the crew's mess, she steered the conversation to the night of Carver's fall. "You must be terribly busy, Mr. Carter," she said, "sending messages from the bridge. I suppose the captain keeps you on your toes." Carter grinned, warming to her interest. "He does, ma'am. That night he was on the bridge all right, barking orders about our course to Malta. Kept me hopping with updates to the mainland. But he stepped out for a bit, said he needed to check something on deck. Didn't think much of it. He's always moving about." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her smile remained serene. "How diligent of him. Do you recall when he left?" Carter scratched his head. "Around 10, I'd say. Wasn't gone long, 15 minutes maybe. Came back looking a bit rattled, but he didn't say why." This was a crack in the alibi, Miss Marple thought. 15 minutes was enough to reach the starboard deck and return, especially if Holt knew the watch was unmanned. She thanked Carter and made her way to the lounge, where she found Mrs. Pritchard, ever eager to gossip. "I heard something curious, Miss Marple," the widow confided. "The captain invested heavily in one of Mr. Carver's ventures, a shipping deal, I think. Lost a fortune when it failed. My cousin's husband knows a man in London who said Holt was furious, felt Carver had misled him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting this into the pattern. A financial loss, a public humiliation, and a moment's absence from the bridge. All pointed to Holt as a man with motive and opportunity. Yet the cufflink with Vance's initials and Clara's note complicated the picture. Was Holt the mastermind or a pawn in a larger scheme? In her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the sea's dark expanse a mirror to her thoughts. The captain's alibi was not ironclad, and his financial grudge against Carver was compelling. Yet his authority made him a convenient scapegoat, and she wondered if someone, Clara perhaps, or Vance, was manipulating events to cast suspicion on him. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how a trusted figure could be framed to divert attention. She murmured, "A captain's power is his strength, but also his vulnerability. What did you do, Captain Holt, in those missing minutes?" She resolved to press further, for the truth, she sensed, was close, hidden in the shadows of the Aurora's polished facade. Chapter 8. The Crew Member's Confession. The SS. Aurora continued its journey through the Mediterranean, the sun climbing high as it cast a deceptive calm over the ship's gleaming decks. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, observed the passengers and crew with a gaze that pierced the veneer of normalcy. The shadow of Leonard Carver's death hung over the voyage, and the threads of suspicion, Captain Holt's questionable alibi, Clara Beaumont's calculated charm, Hugo Vance's smoldering grudge, and Tom Riley's nervous secrecy, wove a complex tapestry in her mind. Today, her focus returned to Tom, the young crew member whose fear suggested he held a key to the mystery, a key she was determined to unlock. Tom Riley's agitation had grown more pronounced since Miss Marple's last encounter with him. His boyish face, once open and eager, was now marked by dark circles under his eyes, and his hands trembled as he went about his duties. She had seen such signs before in St. Mary Mead, where a young shop assistant, burdened by guilt over a petty theft, had worn his anxiety like a second skin. Tom, she suspected, was no murderer, but his role, whether witness or unwilling accomplice, was pivotal. His passing of notes, first to an unknown passenger and then to Clara, hinted at a deeper entanglement, and the threat she had overheard in the storage room suggested he was under someone's control. Miss Marple decided to approach him directly, choosing a moment when the deck was quiet, the passengers distracted by a mid-morning lecture on ancient ruins. She found Tom in the galley, stacking dishes with a clatter that betrayed his nerves. His uniform was slightly askew, a detail that would have been unthinkable under Captain Holt's exacting standards in calmer times. She approached with her usual air of kindly concern, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "You've been working so hard. It must be exhausting, especially with all this dreadful business about Mr. Carver." Tom started, nearly dropping a plate, and his eyes darted to the door before settling on her. "Mornin', ma'am," he mumbled, his London accent thick with unease. "Just doing my job. Gotta keep busy, you know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile warm but her eyes searching. "It's a comfort to see such dedication, though I imagine it's hard to stay cheerful after such a tragedy. You were on duty that night, weren't you? It must weigh on you, knowing you were so close to where it happened." Tom's face paled, and his hands gripped the edge of a tray. "I told you, ma'am. I was below decks, checking supplies. Didn't see nothing." His voice was tight, and he turned back to the dishes, his movements jerky. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle but insistent. "I'm sure you were, dear, but young men like you notice things, don't they? In my village, I knew a lad much like you, always watching, always listening. He saw something once, something he was afraid to tell, but it helped solve a terrible wrong. You wouldn't want to carry such a burden, Tom. if you saw something that night." Tom's hands froze, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. His eyes, wide with panic, met hers, and the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I didn't push him, ma'am. I swear it. I didn't do it." His voice cracked, and he glanced around, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "But I saw something. I wasn't supposed to, but I did." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "What did you see, Tom?" she asked, her voice a soothing balm. "You can tell me. I'm just an old lady, no one to fear." Tom swallowed hard, his hands twisting the cloth he held. "It was dark, ma'am, near the starboard railing. I was coming up from the stores, taking a shortcut through the deck. I saw a figure, tall, moving quick, near where Mr. Carver fell. Couldn't see who it was, not clear. But they were there, and then they were gone, and I heard the scream." He shuddered, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I didn't say nothing 'cause someone told me to keep quiet. Said I'd lose my job, maybe worse." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face betrayed no excitement. "Someone threatened you, Tom? That's a heavy burden for a young man to carry. Who was it?" Tom shook his head, his eyes darting to the door again. "I can't say, ma'am. They know about my debts, see? Back in London I owe money, gambling like a fool. Mr. Carver knew, too. He caught me once, said he'd tell the captain, get me sacked. Whoever's holding this over me, they're powerful. I can't risk it." His voice broke, and he turned away, resuming his work with a desperation that tugged at her heart. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "You've been very brave to tell me this much, Tom. Don't worry, I shan't breathe a word. But you must take care. Secrets can be dangerous, especially on a ship like this." She left him to his dishes, her mind racing with this new revelation. Tom's confession confirmed her suspicion that he was a witness, not a culprit, but his fear pointed to a controlling hand. The tall figure he described could match Hugo Vance's lean frame or Captain Holt's commanding presence, but the vagueness of his account left room for doubt. The threat against him, tied to his gambling debts, suggested someone with knowledge of his past, someone like Carver, or perhaps someone who had inherited Carver's leverage. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how blackmail could twist a man's soul, and Tom's terror was a mirror to that truth. Her next move was to verify Tom's story and identify the figure he had seen. She sought out Elsie, the chatty stewardess, who was polishing silver in the dining saloon. Over a cup of tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the crew's movements. "Elsie," she said, "you must see so much, working among the passengers. That poor boy, Tom, seems so shaken. I suppose he's been under pressure, with his duties and all." Elsie's eyes gleamed with gossip. "Oh, Tom's in a state, ma'am. Ever since Mr. Carver's fall, he's been jumpy as a cat. I heard him talking to one of the other lads, saying he saw something that night but was told to keep mum. Said it was someone high up, someone who could ruin him. I reckon it's got to do with his debts. He's always going on about money he owes." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, masking her excitement. "Someone high up? How dreadful. Did he say anything else?" Elsie shook her head. "Not much, ma'am. Just that he's scared stiff. I saw him pass another note yesterday, in the lounge, to Miss Beaumont. Looked like he didn't want to, but he did it anyway." This confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion of a link between Tom and Clara. The notes suggested a chain of communication, perhaps coercion, but the identity of the puppet master remained elusive. She thanked Elsie and made her way to the library, where she could think undisturbed. There, she reflected on Tom's confession, a tall figure, a threat tied to debts, and a connection to Clara. The figure could be Vance, whose grudge made him a prime suspect, or Holt, whose authority could manipulate crew schedules and silence a witness. Clara's role, with her notes and charm, was increasingly central, but whether she was orchestrating or obeying was unclear. That evening, at the ship's talent show, Miss Marple watched Tom closely. He moved among the tables, serving drinks with a forced smile, his eyes darting to Clara, who was performing a song to enthusiastic applause. Captain Holt stood at the back, his posture rigid, while Hugo Vance sat alone, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple noted a brief moment when Tom passed by Holt, their eyes meeting in a fleeting, tense exchange. Was Holt the one holding Tom's debts over him, or was Vance, with his personal vendetta, pulling the strings? To test her theory, Miss Marple lingered after the show, pretending to misplace her shawl. As the crowd dispersed, she saw Tom slip into a corridor near the crew quarters, his movements furtive. She followed at a discreet distance, her soft-soled shoes silent on the carpet. Near a storage room, she heard voices again, one unmistakably Tom's, low and pleading. "I did what you asked," he said. "I kept quiet. Please, don't tell him about the money." The other voice, muffled but firm, replied, "You'll do as you're told, or you're finished." Miss Marple strained to hear more, but footsteps approached, and she retreated behind a stack of crates, her heart steady despite the risk. Tom emerged, his face ashen, and hurried away. The second figure remained hidden, but the threat echoed in her mind. In her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the sea's dark expanse a canvas for her thoughts. Tom's confession, the notes to Clara, the threats, all pointed to a conspiracy, with Tom as a reluctant pawn. The tall figure he saw could implicate Vance or Holt, but the cufflink and Clara's involvement muddied the waters. In St. Mary Mead, she had unraveled a case of blackmail by following the trail of fear, and here Tom's terror was her guide. She murmured, "A frightened boy sees more than he says, but not enough to save himself. Who holds your leash, Tom?" She resolved to press further, for the truth was close, hidden in the shadows of the Aurora's polished corridors. Chapter 9. The Guest's Deception. The SS. Aurora sailed on, its gleaming decks bathed in the soft light of a Mediterranean dawn, the sea stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting needles clicking with quiet precision, observed the passengers with a gaze that cut through the morning's deceptive calm. The mystery of Leonard Carver's death lingered like a shadow, and her mind wove together the threads she had gathered. Captain Holt's questionable alibi, Tom Riley's frightened confession, Hugo Vance's smoldering grudge, and Clara Beaumont's calculated charm. Today, her focus returned to Clara, whose radiant exterior masked a complexity that Miss Marple found increasingly suspect. In St. Mary Mead, she had known women whose beauty concealed sharp ambition, and Clara, she sensed, was no mere bystander in this deadly drama. Clara Beaumont moved through the ship like a star, her laughter bright and her gestures graceful, drawing admiring glances from passengers and crew alike. Yet Miss Marple had noted the artifice in her charm, the way her eyes scanned a room before she spoke, the calculated pause before her smiles. The note found in the library. "You'll regret crossing me. Meet me at 10, starboard deck," written in Clara's hand and scented with her jasmine perfume, suggested a role in Carver's fate. The maid's report of Clara leaving Carver's cabin in haste, combined with Tom Riley's furtive notes to her, pointed to a deeper involvement. Was Clara the orchestrator of a plot or a pawn in someone else's game? Miss Marple resolved to find out. Her opportunity came at luncheon in the Grand Saloon, where Clara sat at a central table, her sapphire earrings catching the light as she entertained a group of passengers with tales of Parisian fashion. Miss Marple, seated nearby with Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard, watched Clara closely, noting how her laughter rang a touch too bright, her glances darting toward Hugo Vance at a corner table and Captain Holt, who stood briefly at the entrance before departing. Mrs. Pritchard, ever eager for gossip, leaned close. "That Miss Beaumont," she whispered. "She's got half the ship in her thrall. But I heard from my maid, Jenny, that she was seen arguing with Mr. Carver in his cabin the night he died. Jenny said she looked furious when she left." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. "How intriguing," she said. "Miss Beaumont seems so composed. I suppose Mr. Carver could be provoking." Mrs. Pritchard nodded vigorously. "Oh, yes. Jenny said she heard raised voices, something about a promise not kept. And then there's that business with Mr. Vance. I saw them talking yesterday near the lifeboats, and it looked like more than a friendly chat." This confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions of a connection between Clara and Vance, but the argument with Carver was new. She recalled the note's threatening tone and wondered if it stemmed from a broken promise. In St. Mary Mead, a jilted young woman had once forged a letter to exact revenge, and Clara's poise suggested a mind capable of such calculation. Determined to test her, Miss Marple approached Clara after luncheon, catching her alone on the promenade deck as she leaned against the railing, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and disarming, "I must compliment you on your elegance. You've brought such brightness to this voyage, despite its sorrows." Clara turned, her smile immediate but guarded. "Why, thank you, Miss Marple. You're too kind. It's been a trying time, but one must keep spirits up." Her tone was light, but her fingers tightened on the railing. "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her eyes soft but probing. "I found a note in the library yesterday, quite by chance. It seemed to be in a lady's hand, something about a meeting on the starboard deck. It made me think of poor Mr. Carver. You were close to him, weren't you?" Clara's smile faltered, and her eyes narrowed, though she recovered quickly. "A note? How curious. I'm afraid I don't know anything about it. As for Mr. Carver, we chatted a few times. He was quite the talker, you know, but nothing more." Her voice was smooth, but her fingers twisted the scarf, betraying her unease. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course, my dear, though I heard you visited his cabin that evening. It must have been distressing, being so near when tragedy struck." Clara's face stiffened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might deny it. "I may have stopped by," she said, her tone careful. "He wanted to discuss a business matter, something about investments. But it was brief, and I left well before anything happened." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Really, Miss Marple, you make it sound so mysterious." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle. "Just an old lady's curiosity. You must forgive me." She excused herself, leaving, Clara staring after her, her composure visibly shaken. The encounter confirmed Clara's deception, Miss Marple thought as she returned to her chair. The note, the cabin visit, and her evasive answers pointed to a deliberate role in Carver's fate. But was she acting alone or in concert with another? The connection to Vance, hinted at by Mrs. Pritchard, and Tom's notes to her suggested a wider conspiracy. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case where a young woman's flirtations had masked her role as a go-between for a smuggling ring. Clara, she suspected, was similarly positioned, her charm a veil for darker purposes. Her next clue came unexpectedly that afternoon when she visited the ship's purser, Mr. Dawkins, to inquire about a fictional lost earring. As he searched his ledger, she steered the conversation to passenger activities. "Miss Beaumont seems so popular," she said. "I suppose she keeps you busy with requests." Dawkins chuckled. "Oh, she's a lively one, ma'am. Always sending cables to Paris. Says it's for her dressmaking business, but she's sent a dozen since we sailed. And she's been asking about the crew schedules, which I thought odd. Wanted to know who was on watch the night Mr. Carver fell." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. How curious. Did she say why? Dawkins shook his head. "Just said she was worried about safety, but between you and me, she seemed more interested in who was where than in the ship's security." This was a vital thread, Miss Marple thought. Clara's interest in the watch schedules suggested she knew of the lapse that had left the starboard deck unmanned. Had she orchestrated it, perhaps through Tom, to ensure Carver was alone? The cables to Paris, meanwhile, might be a cover for communication with an accomplice off the ship. Miss Marple thanked Dawkins and made her way to the lounge, where she hoped to observe Clara further. That evening, at a poetry reading in the saloon, Clara was in her element, reciting a verse with theatrical flair. Yet Miss Marple noted how her eyes strayed to Hugo Vance, who sat near the back, his expression taut. When the reading ended, Clara approached him, their conversation brief but intense, her hand brushing his sleeve before she moved on. Miss Marple, seated with a group of older ladies, also watched Tom Riley, who was clearing glasses with a forced calm. His gaze followed Clara, and when she passed him, their eyes met in a fleeting, anxious exchange. To probe further, Miss Marple lingered after the reading, pretending to search for a dropped knitting needle. As the crowd thinned, she saw Clara slip into a corridor near the crew quarters, her movements swift and purposeful. Curious, Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her soft-soled shoes silent on the carpet. Near a service door, Clara paused, glancing around before speaking to someone in the shadows. Miss Marple couldn't hear the words, but Clara's posture, urgent, almost pleading, suggested a clandestine purpose. Before Miss Marple could draw closer, Clara vanished through the door, and the other figure was gone. In her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the sea's dark expanse a mirror to her thoughts. Clara's deception was clear. The note, the cabin argument, her inquiries about the watch, and her secretive meetings all pointed to a central role. Yet her fear, evident in her tense exchanges, suggested she was not wholly in control. Was she working with Vance, whose grudge made him a likely partner? Or with Holt, whose authority could manipulate the ship's routines? Tom's notes to her hinted at coercion, but whose hand held the reins? Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a charming young woman had lured a victim to his doom, acting under the orders of a jealous lover. Clara, she suspected, was similarly positioned, her beauty a tool in a larger scheme. As she tucked her knitting away, she murmured, "Charm is a dangerous mask, Miss Beaumont." But whose truth does it hide? She resolved to watch Clara's next move, for the web was tightening, and the truth, she sensed, was close to breaking free. Chapter 10. The Rival's Motive. The SS. Aurora glided through the Mediterranean's tranquil waters, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across its polished decks. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, rhythmic precision, observed the passengers with a gaze that saw beyond their smiles and pleasantries. The mystery of Leonard Carver's death, a dark undercurrent beneath the ship's elegance, consumed her thoughts. The threads she had gathered, Captain Holt's compromised alibi, Tom Riley's frightened confession, Clara Beaumont's deceptive charm, and Hugo Vance's smoldering grudge, formed a complex pattern, but the heart of the truth remained elusive. Her focus now returned to Vance, whose personal animosity toward Carver hinted at a motive deeper than business rivalry, a motive she was determined to unravel. Hugo Vance was a man of sharp contrasts to the boisterous Carver, his lean frame and reserved demeanor masking a quiet intensity that Miss Marple found both compelling and suspect. She had noted his scowl at Carver during the first night's dinner, his bitter words about a ruined business deal, and the torn cufflink engraved with HV found near the starboard railing. His conversation with her on the deck, where he admitted to a personal loss beyond financial ruin, had struck a chord. In St. Mary Mead, she had known men whose pride, once wounded, turned to vengeance, and Vance's guarded candor suggested a man nursing such a wound. The question was whether that wound had driven him to murder. Her opportunity to probe further came during a late afternoon lecture on Mediterranean trade routes held in the ship's library. Vance was present, seated alone near a window, his dark eyes fixed on the speaker, but his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Miss Marple, under the pretense of needing assistance with her shawl, approached him as the lecture ended, her voice soft and disarming. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I was so fascinated by the lecture, but I confess I know little of business matters. You must be quite an expert, having dealt with men like Mr. Carver." Vance turned, his expression wary but polite. "Hardly an expert, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and measured. "Carver was a lesson in ruthlessness. He outplayed me in a deal that cost me dearly. But that's business." His fingers tightened around the arm of his chair, betraying a tension his words sought to conceal. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile gentle but probing. "How trying it must have been. In my village, I've seen how such losses can weigh on a man, especially when they're personal. I heard Mr. Carver's actions affected more than your business. Something about a lady, perhaps?" Vance's eyes flashed, a flicker of anger quickly masked. "You've been listening to gossip," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "Carver was a liar, Miss Marple. Years ago, he spread stories about me, vile things, that cost me an engagement. The woman I loved believed him, and I lost her. That's the kind of man he was. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking." He leaned back, his jaw set, but his eyes held a challenge, as if daring her to press further. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "How dreadful for you. Such betrayals linger, don't they? I suppose you must have been relieved to see him gone, even if you had no hand in it." Vance's laugh was bitter, a short bark that drew a glance from a nearby passenger. "Relieved? I won't lie. I hated him, but I'd rather have seen him ruined than dead. Death's too quick for a man like Carver. He rose, excusing himself with a curt nod, and strode out, his shoulders rigid. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloging his words. The broken engagement was a new thread, one that deepened Vance's motive. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how love, when thwarted, could turn to venom, and Vance's candor, while disarming, did not absolve him. The cufflink placed him, or someone framing him, at the scene, and his tense exchanges with Clara Beaumont suggested a connection that warranted scrutiny. Her next clue came at dinner, where she overheard a conversation between two passengers, a retired banker and his wife, seated nearby. "Vance was in a state last night," the banker said, slicing his steak. "I saw him in the smoking room, drinking heavily, kept muttering about Carver getting his comeuppance. Said something about a woman who deserved better, and how Carver had paid for his lies. I thought it a bit much, even for a rival." Miss Marple's teacup paused midway to her lips. Vance's drunken remarks echoed his conversation with her, but the phrase, "paid for his lies," was telling. It suggested a sense of justice fulfilled, a sentiment that could imply guilt. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead case, where a jilted lover's boasts had betrayed his role in a vandalism scheme. Vance's openness, she mused, might be a calculated defiance, masking a darker truth. Determined to explore his movements, Miss Marple sought out the ship's stewardess, Elsie, who was tidying the lounge after dinner. "Elsie," she said, her voice warm, "you must see so much, moving about the ship. I noticed Mr. Vance seems rather solitary. Was he out much the night Mr. Carver fell?" Elsie's eyes gleamed with the thrill of gossip. "Oh, ma'am, he was about all right. I saw him on the starboard deck earlier that evening, pacing like he was waiting for someone. Looked angry, too. And later, just before the scream, I saw him near the lounge, heading toward the deck again. Didn't think much of it then, but now—" She trailed off, her expression uneasy. This placed Vance near the scene, Miss Marple thought, her heart quickening though her face remained placid. The cufflink, his presence on the deck, and his personal grudge formed a damning picture, yet his frankness puzzled her. A guilty man, she reasoned, would be more guarded unless he believed his candor would deflect suspicion. She thanked Elsie and made her way to the library, where she could reflect undisturbed. There, she considered the connections. Vance's motive, rooted in both business and personal betrayal, his proximity to the starboard deck, and his interactions with Clara, who had lured Carver with her note. Tom Riley's confession of seeing a tall figure matched Vance's lean frame, but the threat against Tom suggested a broader conspiracy. Was Vance the mastermind, using Clara's charm and Tom's vulnerability to orchestrate Carver's death? Or was he, like Tom, a pawn in a larger scheme, perhaps led by Captain Holt? Her thoughts were interrupted by a chance encounter on the deck that evening. As she took her nightly stroll, the sea air cool against her cheeks, she saw Vance and Clara in a heated exchange near the lifeboats. Clara's voice was low but urgent, her hands gesturing sharply, while Vance shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and resolve. Miss Marple paused behind a stack of deck chairs, her small figure nearly invisible in the shadows, and strained to hear. "You can't back out now," Clara hissed, her usual poise replaced by intensity. "It's done, and you know why." Vance's reply was curt. "I did what I had to, Clara. Don't push me further." He turned and strode away, leaving Clara staring after him, her face pale. Miss Marple's mind raced. The exchange suggested complicity, but its nature was unclear. Had Vance acted alone, driven by his grudge, with Clara as his accomplice, or were they both under another's influence? The cufflink, she noted, matched Vance's attire. She had seen him wearing similar ones at dinner, but its convenient discovery near the railing gnawed at her. In St. Mary Mead, a planted clue had once misled the police, and she wondered if someone was framing Vance to divert attention. In her cabin, Miss Marple sat by the porthole, the sea's dark expanse a mirror to her thoughts. She laid out her clues. The cufflink, Vance's motive, his presence on the deck, his tense exchange with Clara, and Tom's sighting of a tall figure. The pattern pointed to Vance as a prime suspect, yet his openness suggested either supreme confidence or innocence. Clara's role, with her note and whispered meetings, was pivotal, and Tom's fear hinted at a controlling hand, possibly Captain Holt's. As she tucked her knitting away, Miss Marple murmured, "A man's pride can be his undoing, Mr. Vance, but so can another's cunning. What part did you play in this deadly dance?" She resolved to verify the cufflink's significance and probe Vance's connection to Clara further, for the truth, she sensed, was tantalizingly close, hidden in the interplay of motive and deception aboard the Aurora. Chapter 11. The Pieces Align. The SS. Aurora neared Gibraltar, its gleaming decks awash in the golden light of a Mediterranean afternoon, the sea stretching toward the horizon like a promise of resolution. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her wicker chair on the promenade deck, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, familiar rhythm, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. The threads she had gathered, Captain Holt's questionable alibi, Tom Riley's frightened confession, Clara Beaumont's deceptive charm, Hugo Vance's personal grudge, and the torn cufflink engraved with HV, formed a tapestry that was intricate but incomplete. In her cabin, as the ship's gentle sway mirrored the rhythm of her thoughts, Miss Marple resolved to piece together the clues, for the truth of Leonard Carver's death was close, shimmering just beneath the surface of the Aurora's polished facade. She began by laying out her findings in her mind, as she often did in St. Mary Mead when a village scandal required unraveling. The cufflink, found near the starboard railing, pointed to Vance, but its convenient discovery suggested a possible plant, a tactic she had seen used to mislead in a theft case back home. Tom's confession of seeing a tall figure near the railing matched Vance's lean frame, but could also describe Captain Holt, whose authority allowed him to manipulate the watch schedule. Clara's note, "You'll regret crossing me. Meet me at 10, starboard deck," implicated her as a lure, and her tense exchanges with Vance and Tom hinted at a broader conspiracy. Holt's financial losses, tied to Carver's ventures, provided a motive, and his absence from the bridge during the critical minutes raised doubts about his alibi. Yet the interplay of these elements, motive, opportunity, and deception, required a unifying thread. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her shawl draped neatly, and made her way to the starboard deck, where Carver had met his end. The railing gleamed under the sun. The scuff mark near the lifeboat gave it a faint reminder of a struggle. She stood there, picturing the scene. Carver, a heavy man, would have required strength to push over the high railing, ruling out Clara as the sole actor. Vance, tall and wiry, had the physical capability, as did Holt, whose robust frame belied his years. Tom, though strong from his deckhand duties, was too frightened to act alone, suggesting he was a witness or accomplice under coercion. The lapse in the watch, orchestrated through a false call from the purser's office, pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the ship's routines. Holt, most likely, or someone he trusted. Her thoughts turned to Clara's role. The note, the cabin argument, and her inquiries about the watch schedule suggested she had lured Carver to the deck, but her fear in recent encounters hinted at manipulation by another. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen a young woman coerced into a scheme by a domineering lover, and Clara's tense exchanges with Vance suggested a similar dynamic. Yet Holt's authority could also bend her to his will, especially if he held leverage, perhaps tied to her mysterious cables to Paris. Tom's notes to Clara and the threats he faced pointed to a chain of control, with someone, Vance or Holt, at its head. To test her theory, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Dawkins, the purser, under the pretense of inquiring about the ship's itinerary. As he chatted about Gibraltar's sights, she steered the conversation to the crew's movements. "Mr. Dawkins," she said, her voice soft, "you must have such a keen eye for detail. That call to the starboard watch the night Mr. Carver fell, did it come from your office directly?" Dawkins frowned, his ledger open before him. "That's the odd thing, ma'am. I checked the log after you asked last time, and there's no record of it. Someone used the intercom, but it wasn't me or my staff. I reported it to the captain, but he said it was likely a mix-up." His tone suggested doubt, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. The false call was deliberate, confirming her suspicion of an insider's hand. She thanked Dawkins and made her way to the library, where she could reflect undisturbed. There, she recalled a saint. Mary Mead case, where a forged letter had lured a victim to a secluded spot, orchestrated by a man with both motive and opportunity. Here, the false call, the cufflink, and Clara's note formed a similar pattern, but the question remained. Who stood at the center? Vance's personal grudge was compelling, but his openness puzzled her. Holt's authority and financial losses made him a strong candidate, yet his absence from the bridge was too brief to be conclusive. Clara's charm and Tom's fear suggested they were tools in a larger scheme. But whose? That evening, at a musical recital in the Grand Saloon, Miss Marple observed the suspects closely. Clara, radiant in a crimson gown, performed a duet with a passenger, her smile bright, but her eyes darting to Vance, who sat alone, his expression taut. Holt stood at the entrance, his uniform impeccable, but his posture strained, as if bracing for scrutiny. Tom moved among the tables, serving drinks with a forced calm, his gaze avoiding Clara's. Miss Marple noted a moment when Holt nodded to Tom, a subtle gesture that could have been routine, but felt weighted with meaning. To probe further, she lingered after the recital, pretending to misplace her spectacles. As the crowd dispersed, she saw Clara and Vance in a shadowed corner, their voices low but urgent. "It's too late to change things," Clara whispered, her hand gripping his arm. "You wanted this as much as I did." Vance's reply was sharp. "Don't put this on me, Clara. I settled my score, but you played your part." He pulled away, leaving her visibly shaken. Miss Marple's mind raced. The exchange confirmed their complicity, but Vance's words, "I settled my score," suggested he had acted directly, perhaps pushing Carver himself. Yet the cufflink's convenient placement and the false watch call pointed to a careful plan, one that might implicate Holt. In St. Mary Mead, a planted clue had once diverted suspicion from the true culprit. and Miss Marple wondered if Vance was being framed, or if he was clever enough to feign innocence. Returning to her cabin, she sat by the porthole, the sea's dark expanse a canvas for her thoughts. She laid out her clues. The cufflink, likely Vance's but possibly planted. Tom's sighting of a tall figure, matching Vance or Holt. Clara's note and cabin visit, marking her as a lure. The false watch call, requiring insider knowledge, and Holt's financial motive and brief absence from the bridge. The pattern suggested a conspiracy, with Clara and Tom as pawns, but the mastermind remained unclear. Vance's personal betrayal was a powerful motive, but Holt's authority gave him the means to orchestrate the lapse and silence Tom. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case where a man's desperation had led to a calculated act, masked by another's apparent guilt. Here, the pieces aligned toward Vance, but Holt's role gnawed at her. The truth, she sensed, lay in the interplay of their motives. Vance's need for vengeance, Holt's financial ruin, and Clara's charm as the linchpin. As she tucked her knitting away, she murmured, "The pieces fit, but the picture is not yet clear. One last thread, and the truth will shine." She resolved to confront the suspects at the final dinner, where the Aurora's secrets would be laid bare. Chapter 12. The Truth Revealed. The SS. Aurora lay anchored off Gibraltar, its white hull aglow under the Mediterranean moon, the lights of the port twinkling in the distance like a promise of resolution. In the grand saloon, the final dinner of the cruise was a glittering affair, with chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables laden with crystal and silver. Yet beneath the elegance, a current of tension ran through the passengers, the shadow of Leonard Carver's death lingering like an uninvited guest. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a table with Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard and other chatty companions, her knitting folded neatly beside her, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. The threads she had gathered, Captain Holt's compromised alibi, Tom Riley's frightened confession, Clara Beaumont's deceptive charm, Hugo Vance's personal grudge, the torn cufflink, and the orchestrated lapse in the watch, had woven a tapestry that now demanded its final stitch. Tonight, she would unravel the truth. Miss Marple had spent the day reflecting in her cabin, the sea's gentle sway a mirror to her thoughts. The clues formed a clear pattern. The cufflink, engraved with HV, pointed to Vance, but its convenient discovery suggested a possible plant. Tom's sighting of a tall figure near the starboard railing matched Vance's lean frame, but could also describe Holt. Clara's note, luring Carver to the deck, and her tense exchanges with Vance and Tom implicated her as a conspirator, while Holt's financial losses and brief absence from the bridge gave him motive and opportunity. The false call that cleared the watch required insider knowledge, pointing to Holt's authority. Yet Vance's personal betrayal, a ruined engagement, burned brightest, a motive that resonated with the desperation Miss Marple had seen in St. Mary Mead, where a wronged man had once sabotaged a rival's livelihood. As the dessert course was served, Miss Marple requested a word Johanna to gather the suspects in the lounge after dinner, a plan she had devised with the purser's assistance. The room, softly lit and filled with the murmur of conversation, grew hushed as she rose, her frail figure commanding attention despite her unassuming demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I have a few words to say about the sad fate of Mr. Leonard Carver." The room stilled, forks pausing midair. Captain Holt, seated at the head table, stiffened, his hand tightening on his glass. Hugo Vance, at a corner table, fixed her with a wary stare. Clara Beaumont, radiant in emerald silk, froze mid-laugh, while Tom Riley, serving nearby, nearly dropped a tray. Mrs. Pritchard gasped, her fan fluttering excitedly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Mr. Carver's death was no accident, as some of you may suspect. He was pushed from the starboard deck, a deliberate act born of deep-seated motive. I have pieced together the truth, and it is time to lay it bare. She began with the cufflink, holding it up for all to see, its silver surface catching the light. This was found near the railing where Mr. Carver fell, engraved with the initials H.V., Mr. Hugo Vance's initials, a damning clue, one might think. Vance's face paled, but he said nothing, his jaw tight. Yet its placement was too convenient, as if meant to be found. In my village, I once saw a handkerchief planted to mislead, and I suspected this was similar. She turned to the captain. Captain Holt, you spoke of an accident, but your argument with Mr. Carver over failed investments, a shipping venture that cost you dearly, suggests a motive. Your absence from the bridge for 15 minutes that night, as confirmed by the radio officer, gave you opportunity, and the false call that cleared the starboard watch came from your purser's office, a place only someone with authority could exploit. Holt's face reddened, but his voice was steady. I was on the bridge, Miss Marple. My crew can confirm it. I had no hand in this. Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle. Perhaps, but let us consider Miss Beaumont. She turned to Clara, whose smile was frozen, her eyes wide. A note in your hand, scented with jasmine, lured Mr. Carver to the deck with a threat. You'll regret crossing me. You argued with him in his cabin that night, over a broken promise, perhaps. Your inquiries about the watch schedule suggest you knew it would be unmanned. Clara's laugh was brittle. That's absurd. I barely knew him. It was just a business talk, nothing more. Her hand trembled, betraying her composure. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice was firm. And Tom Riley, a frightened young man, saw a tall figure near the railing that night. He was threatened into silence, his gambling debts used as leverage. His notes to you, Miss Beaumont, suggest you were part of that coercion. Tom's face went ashen, his tray clattering softly. I didn't do it, ma'am, he whispered. I swear. I believe you, Tom, Miss Marple said kindly. You were a witness, coerced by fear, but the truth lies in the motives. She turned to Vance, her eyes locking onto his. Mr. Vance, your hatred for Mr. Carver was no secret. A business deal ruined you, but worse, his lies cost you a fiancé years ago, a personal wound that never healed. You were seen on the deck that night, pacing, angry. You spoke of settling a score, and your cufflink places you at the scene. Vance stood, his voice low and fierce. I hated him, yes, but I didn't kill him. Someone's trying to pin this on me. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. The pieces tell a story. The false watch call required insider knowledge, Captain Holt's domain. The note was Clara's, luring Carver to his doom. Tom saw a tall figure, likely Vance. But the motive burns brightest with you, Mr. Vance. Not just business, but a betrayal of love and honor. You pushed Mr. Carver over that railing to settle an old score, exploiting the watch lapse and Clara's charm to ensure he was alone. The room was silent, all eyes on Vance. His face crumpled, and he sank back into his chair. It wasn't meant to happen like that, he said, his voice breaking. He ruined me, my life, my love. I followed him that night, yes, After Clara's note got him there, I confronted him, and it got out of hand. He laughed at me, taunted me. I pushed him, and he fell. He buried his face in his hands. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but she said nothing. Holt's expression was grim, but he remained silent, his alibi holding firm. Tom's shoulders sagged with relief, his silence no longer needed. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but clear. The cufflink was yours, Mr. Vance, lost in the struggle, not planted. Clara, you played your part, luring him for Vance, perhaps out of loyalty or coercion. Tom, you were silenced by threats, likely from Vance, who knew your debts. Captain Holt, your losses gave you motive, but your absence was too brief, and the watch call's origin remains untraced to you. As the authorities were summoned from shore, Vance was led away, his head bowed. The saloon buzzed with whispers as Clara fled, her face pale. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting untouched, her eyes on the sea beyond the windows. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how love and betrayal could drive a man to desperation. And here, aboard the Aurora, those forces had claimed a life. She murmured softly, "The heart's wounds cut deepest, and the sea keeps its secrets." As the ship prepared to dock, she folded her hands, the truth at last laid bare.